Pentarch Station diplomatic lounge possessed all the charm of a funeral parlor decorated by committee, which, considering the species involved, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Suspended in the neutral zone between 5 different stellar territories, the station served as humanity's latest attempt at what they generously called interspecies cooperation. The aliens, meanwhile, preferred terms like damage control and please don't shoot us again. Commander Hazel Mooncrest sat in what the station's designers optimistically labeled a universal comfort chair, though it seemed designed by someone who had never encountered a spine. She'd folded her long legs beneath her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to furniture built by aliens who apparently believed humans were constructed like origami cranes. Her combat fatigues bore the casual wrinkles of someone who had recently emerged from a dropship rather than a dress uniform closet, and her service pistol rested against her hip with the comfortable weight of an old friend. Across the circular table, Ambassador Crimson Ironshed adjusted his ceremonial shoulder plates with the mechanical precision that his species had elevated to an art form. The Chelonian diplomat's carapace gleamed under the station's artificial lighting, each segment polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with rankings that supposedly indicated his diplomatic prowess. Humans had learned not to mention that the intricate patterns resembled grocery store price tags. The recent unpleasantness in the outer spiral has been resolved, Crimson announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Minimal casualties, minimal property damage, minimal complications. Nexus Brightfeeder preened at this assessment, his iridescent feathers catching the light as he shifted on his specialized perch. The avian representative had arrived with the sort of confidence that came from never having encountered a predator species that considered his people anything more than decorative. His talons drummed against the table's surface, in what his species considered a display of intellectual superiority, though humans tended to find it reminiscent of impatient teenagers. Indeed, Nexus chirped, his voice carrying the musical quality that made his species excellent opera singers and insufferable negotiators. The Pentarch Alliance has successfully managed another minor skirmish with our characteristic efficiency. Perhaps our newer partners could learn from our measured approach to conflict resolution. The comment hung in the recycled air like a challenge, which was precisely how Nexus intended it. The avian species had built their reputation on what they called civilized warfare, a concept that involved elaborate rules, formal declarations, and casualties counted in the dozens rather than thousands. They approached battle like a chess match played by particularly polite grandmasters who apologized for capturing pieces. Hazel raised an eyebrow but said nothing, instead reaching for her coffee. The station's food synthesizers had managed to produce something that was technically coffee in the same way that synthetic diamonds were technically diamonds, correct on a molecular level, but missing some ineffable quality that made the experience worthwhile. She sipped it, anyway, her expression suggesting she'd tasted worse and lived to tell about it. Minimal casualties, you say? Minister Blue Crystalwing's voice resonated through the chamber like wind chimes in an earthquake. The crystalline entity's form shifted colors as he spoke, cycling through shades that indicated either deep thought or mild indigestion. Our intelligence reports suggest the human involvement was decisive. We prefer efficient, Hazel said mildly, setting down her cup with the gentle care of someone who had learned that even furniture could be weaponized if handled incorrectly. No point in dragging things out when there's work to be done. Nexus's feathers ruffled slightly, a sign that he was either preparing to make a point or working up to a particularly impressive display of plumage. Work, she calls it. Tell me, Commander, exactly how much work did your people accomplish? Perhaps you could share some statistics with those of us curious about human military methodology. The question carried the weight of species superiority wrapped in diplomatic language. Nexus had clearly spent considerable time crafting what he believed was a subtle trap, designed to force the human representative to either admit to minimal involvement or reveal embarrassing details about their military limitations. It was the sort of verbal maneuvering that worked beautifully in avian political circles, where warfare was conducted with the enthusiasm of a book club discussing quarterly reading selections. Captain Onyx Steelclaw hissed softly from his position near the viewing port, his reptilian features arranged in what might have been amusement. The Saurian officer had remained silent throughout the proceedings, content to observe the verbal sparring with the detached interest of a predator watching prey animals establish pecking orders. His species understood violence in ways that made them valuable allies and terrifying enemies, though they approached combat with ritual formality that humans found quaint. Statistics, Hazel repeated, tilting ahead with the innocent expression of someone genuinely puzzled by the question. The gesture was so human, so utterly casual, that it immediately put every non-human in the room on edge. They had learned to be wary when humans looked confused, as it usually preceded revelations that redefined their understanding of the universe in deeply uncomfortable ways. Yes, statistics, Nexus pressed, his confidence growing as he interpreted her hesitation as uncertainty. Kill counts, perhaps? Surely your people keep track of such things for promotional purposes? Hazel blinked slowly, processing the question with the careful consideration of someone trying to determine if they were being asked about their shoe size or their favorite color. Kill count, she repeated thoughtfully. Well, that depends. Are we talking about this year? Or just this planet? The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a diplomatic incident. Ambassador Crimson's ceremonial plates clicked against each other as his entire body went rigid. Minister Blue Crystalwing's color cycling accelerated until he resembled a malfunctioning traffic light. Captain Onyx's tail went completely still, which in Saurian body language indicated either deep meditation or the prelude to extreme violence. Nex's beak opened and closed several times, producing no sound except a faint clicking that suggested his vocal cords had temporarily forgotten their function. His feathers, previously arranged in patterns of confident superiority, now resembled the plumage of a bird that had encountered an unexpected thunderstorm. This year, Crimson managed, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to maintain diplomatic protocol while experiencing existential crisis. Or this planet? Hazel nodded helpfully, apparently oblivious to the fact that her clarification had caused several species to question their life choices. Right, exactly, because the eerie numbers include off-world operations, fleet actions, that sort of thing. But if we're just talking about ground-based planetary operations, that's a completely different metric. I mean, are we counting individual confirmed kills, or are we including collateral from orbital bombardments? Because that changes the numbers significantly. She paused, seemingly struck by another thought that made the assembled diplomats wish they had chosen careers in safer professions like bomb disposal or volcanic research. Oh, and are we talking about my personal count or my unit's combined total? Because that's going to affect the accuracy of whatever statistics you're looking for. The recycled air circulation system hummed quietly in the background, the only sound in a room full of beings who were rapidly recalculating their assumptions about human military doctrine. What they had assumed was a simple question about battlefield experience had apparently opened a conversational door to a dimension where mathematics took on properties that defied comfortable comprehension. Nexus swallowed hard, his throat working visibly as he tried to process information that his brain kept insisting couldn't possibly be accurate. Your personal count? Well, sure, Hazel said, reaching for her coffee again with the casual air of someone discussing weekend plans. I mean, every Marine keeps track. It's basic record keeping. How else would you know if you're meeting your quarterly objectives? Part 2. Statistical clarifications. The diplomatic lounge had taken on the atmosphere of a morgue where the corpses had started asking uncomfortable questions. Hazel, blissfully unaware that she had just introduced concepts that would require several species to update their threat assessment protocols, continued with the helpful demeanor of someone explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow students. See, the thing is, she said, settling back in her chair with the comfort of someone about to share professional insights, the annual tallies get complicated because they include everything. Space engagements, planetary operations, counterinsurgency work, peacekeeping missions, the whole spectrum. But if we're just talking about this specific planetary cleanup, that's much more focused data. Captain Onyx's tail twitched once, a movement so subtle that only the most observant would have noticed it. In Saurian culture, that particular twitch indicated the moment when a predator decided whether to flee or fight. The fact that he chose neither suggested he had entered a third category that his species reserved for encounters with natural disasters and cosmic phenomena. Cleanup, Minister Blue Crystalwing repeated, his crystalline form cycling through colors that had no names in any known language. You characterized recent military operations as cleanup? Hazel nodded with the enthusiasm of someone finally finding common ground. Exactly, though I guess technically it was more of a pest control situation. The local insurgent groups had gotten pretty entrenched, and the planetary government requested assistance with what they called an ecological imbalance. That's diplomatic speak for please make the shooting stop before it affects quarterly profit margins. She paused to sip her synthetic coffee, giving the assembled diplomats time to process the casual way she had reduced what their intelligence reports described as a significant military engagement to the equivalent of calling an exterminator. Ambassador Crimson's ceremonial plates had developed a tremor that suggested either deep philosophical contemplation or the early stages of complete nervous breakdown. The Helix Rebellion lasted 14 months, Nexus managed, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone clinging to facts like life preservers in a storm of incomprehension. Our intelligence estimates suggest it involved over 200,000 combatants across 7 continents. Oh, the Helix thing, Hazel said, brightening as if they were discussing a particularly enjoyable vacation. Yeah, that was a good workout. Though calling it a rebellion is probably overselling it. More like organized banditry with delusions of grandeur. 200,000 sounds about right for total opposition forces, though that includes logistics personnel, civilian sympathizers, and anyone who looked at us wrong. She leaned forward slightly, warming to her subject with the professional enthusiasm that made humans simultaneously excellent teachers and terrifying opponents. Now, if we're talking about my personal contribution to that particular operation, we need to establish parameters. Are we counting direct engagements only, or are we including targets eliminated through coordinated fire missions? Because I called in quite a few orbital strikes, and technically those kills belong to the fleet, but the targeting data came from ground reconnaissance, so there's some overlap in the statistics. The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of implications that made entire species reconsider their foreign policy decisions. It was the sort of quiet that preceded either profound philosophical breakthroughs or complete civilizational panic attacks. On orbital strikes, Ambassador Crimson whispered, his voice carrying the reverence typically reserved for religious ceremonies or funeral rites. You called in orbital strikes. Standard operating procedure? Hazel confirmed with a shrug that somehow managed to be both modest and terrifying. When you're dealing with hardened positions or concentrated enemy formations, precision orbital bombardment is often the most efficient solution. Minimizes friendly casualties, reduces collateral damage to acceptable levels, and sends a clear message about the futility of continued resistance. She paused, struck by what appeared to be a sudden concern for accuracy. Though I should clarify, when I say minimizes collateral damage, I'm using standard human military definitions. Some species might have different thresholds for what constitutes acceptable losses. We found that most planetary governments are surprisingly flexible on that point once they understand the alternatives. Minister Blue Crystalwing's color cycling had accelerated to the point where he resembled a disco ball having an existential crisis. And the alternatives? Extended ground campaigns, Hazel explained patiently. Prolonged urban warfare, door-to-door clearing operations, months of attrition fighting, all the messy, expensive stuff that makes everyone unhappy. Much better to resolve things quickly and cleanly, then move on to rebuilding. Faster, more cost-efficient, and significantly less paperwork. The casual way she discussed the complete reorganization of planetary power structures made the assembled diplomats feel as if they were listening to someone describe their grocery shopping methodology while simultaneously realizing that the grocery store in question was the entire galactic economy. Captain Onyx finally found his voice, though it carried the careful modulation of someone testing whether words still had their traditional meanings. You mentioned rebuilding. The post-conflict reconstruction of Helix Prime was completed in record time, according to our intelligence reports. Oh, that, Hazel said, waving dismissively. That's just standard protocol. No point in breaking something if you're not prepared to fix it properly. The engineering corps moved in about 6 hours after we declared the operational area secure. Roads, power grids, communication networks, governmental infrastructure, the whole package. Most of the locals barely noticed the transition once the shooting stopped. She paused, considering something that made her expression shift slightly. Though I suppose barely noticed might be overstating it. There were some complaints about the new traffic patterns, and apparently we accidentally improved the planetary internet speeds by about 3,000%, which caused some cultural adjustment issues. Nothing major, just the usual growing pains when you upgrade a civilization's entire technological base overnight. The phrase upgrade a civilization's entire technological base overnight hung in the air like a mathematical equation that violated several fundamental laws of physics while somehow still producing correct answers. It was the sort of statement that forced intelligent beings to reconsider their understanding of concepts like reasonable timelines and logistical feasibility. Nexus's feathers had arranged themselves in patterns that suggested either deep contemplation or complete psychological breakdown. The reports mentioned that human forces provided comprehensive security during the reconstruction phase. Well, naturally, Hazel said as if explaining something obvious to someone who had missed an important detail. Can't have the locals getting jumpy while we're installing the new infrastructure. Plus, there were still some holdout groups in the outer territories. Nothing serious, just die-hard types who hadn't gotten the message about the change in management. Standard mop-up operations, really. The way she described what intelligence reports characterized as extensive counterinsurgency operations involving multiple brigade-sized units as standard mop-up operations suggested that human military terminology operated on scales that redefined traditional concepts of proportion and perspective. How extensive were these mop-up operations? Ambassador Crimson asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who suspected the answer might require them to recalibrate their entire understanding of military science. Hazel considered the question with the thoughtful expression of someone trying to recall details from a particularly busy period. Let's see, we had 3 full Marine Expeditionary units on rotation, plus supporting elements from the 47th Armored Division and the 15th Aerospace Wing. Standard peacekeeping deployment, really. Though I think Admiral Storm Hawkeye brought in a couple of destroyers for fire support, just in case things got interesting. She paused, apparently struck by a memory that brought a slight smile to her face. Actually, funny story about that. We ended up not needing the destroyers at all. The holdout groups took one look at the orbital sensor sweeps and decided that surrender was probably their best career move. Saved everyone a lot of paperwork. The assembled diplomat exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication, most of which centered around the growing realization that what humans considered standard peacekeeping deployments involved more firepower than most species brought to actual wars. The diplomatic lounge had achieved the sort of silence typically reserved for moments when entire species collectively realized they had been operating under fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of reality. It was the kind of quiet that preceded either evolutionary leaps in understanding or complete civilizational panic attacks, and given the participants, both outcomes seemed equally likely. Ambassador Crimson cleared his throat with the mechanical precision that his species had developed for moments requiring extreme diplomatic delicacy. Perhaps, he began, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone testing whether traditional concepts still applied, we might establish some comparative baselines. For statistical purposes, you understand. Hazel nodded encouragingly, apparently delighted that the conversation was finally moving toward concrete data. Absolutely, comparisons are always helpful for context. What kind of baselines were you thinking? Well, Crimson continued, his ceremonial plates clicking nervously, in Chelonian military tradition, a distinguished career might involve perhaps 50 to 75 confirmed eliminations over a standard 20-year service period. This would be considered quite exceptional by our standards. The way he delivered this information suggested he was sharing state secrets, though his tone also carried the desperate hope of someone trying to establish that his species' approach to warfare fell within some recognizable parameter of sanity. He looked around the table expectantly, seeking the sort of validation that comes from discovering you're not the only one operating under specific assumptions. Minister Blue Crystal Wing's form shifted through what might have been contemplative hues, though with crystalline entities it was always difficult to distinguish between deep thought and severe indigestion. The crystalline collective maintains similar standards, he offered, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of cautious solidarity. 8. Perhaps 60 to 80 lifetime eliminations for our most accomplished military specialists, though our engagement protocols emphasize precision over volume. Nexus preened slightly, his confidence returning as he recognized an opportunity to demonstrate avian superiority through superior restraint. The Brightfate Confederation prides itself on even more refined military metrics. Our most celebrated warriors might achieve 30 to 40 confirmed eliminations across entire careers, though naturally we emphasize tactical brilliance over crude body counts. The way he delivered this last phrase suggested that he considered it the diplomatic equivalent of a killing blow, a demonstration that his species had evolved beyond the primitive need for excessive violence. His feathers arranged themselves in patterns that indicated smugness mixed with what he clearly believed was moral superiority. Captain Onyx had remained silent throughout these declarations, but his tail performed a series of subtle movements that in saurian body language indicated either profound amusement or the prelude to spectacular violence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the gravelly quality of someone who understood predation on a molecular level. Saurian warriors consider 100 lifetime kills to be adequate, he said, the pause before adequate carrying implications that made the other species suddenly remember why they had historically avoided Saurian space. Though we do not count prey animals or non-combatants, only worthy opponents. The distinction he drew between worthy opponents and everything else suggested that Saurian military philosophy operated on principles that made other species' approaches seem almost pacifistic by comparison. His reptilian features arranged themselves in what might have been a smile, though it looked more like a geological formation preparing to consume something. Hazel listened to these revelations with the polite attention of someone hearing interesting trivia about unfamiliar hobbies. "Those are some solid numbers," she said encouragingly, though her tone carried the same quality someone might use when praising a child's finger painting. Very respectable for career totals. The phrase career totals landed among the assembled diplomats like an unexploded ordnance that everyone suddenly realized was still ticking. The implication that she was comparing their lifetime achievements to some other category of measurement created the sort of conceptual vertigo that made intelligent beings question their fundamental assumptions about mathematics. Career totals, Nexus repeated, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable reconstruction. As opposed to? Well, there are lots of different ways to track these things, Hazel explained helpfully. Career totals, annual averages, deployment-specific numbers, mission-based statistics. It really depends on what kind of analysis you're trying to do. I mean, my career total is obviously much higher than my annual average, but if we're talking about specific operations, those numbers can vary significantly depending on the mission parameters. She paused, apparently struck by a thought that made her expression shift slightly. Actually, are we including non-human targets in these statistics? Because that changes the calculations considerably. Some species are easier to eliminate than others, and there are questions about whether certain types of artificial intelligences should count as individual kills or system terminations. The casual way she discussed the relative difficulty of eliminating different species made the assembled diplomats feel as if they were listening to someone compare the nutritional content of various breakfast cereals, while simultaneously realizing that they might be items on the menu rather than fellow consumers. Minister Blue Crystal Wing's color cycling had developed a pattern that resembled a warning beacon malfunctioning during an emergency. You distinguish between human and non-human targets. Standard practice, Hazel confirmed with a nod. Different species have different physiological vulnerabilities, combat doctrines, technological capabilities, all factors that affect engagement difficulty and resource allocation. Plus, there are administrative considerations. Eliminating enemy combatants from species with formal surrender protocols requires different paperwork than dealing with entities that fight to extinction or artificial intelligences that don't technically die so much as become inoperative. The way she discussed the bureaucratic aspects of interspecies warfare suggested that human military administration had evolved systems for cataloguing violence that operated on scales requiring specialized forms of mathematics. It was the sort of revelation that made other species wonder if they had been approaching the entire concept of organized conflict from the wrong philosophical direction. Ambassador Crimson's ceremonial plates had developed a rhythm that suggested either deep meditation or the early stages of complete systemic failure. And your personal statistics fall into which categories? Hazel considered the question with the thoughtful expression of someone trying to organize complex data into comprehensible formats. That gets complicated because my service record spans multiple theaters and command structures. I started as regular infantry, did a stint with special operations, then moved into Marine Force reconnaissance before my current assignment. Each branch has different counting methodologies and performance metrics. She paused, apparently working through some internal calculations that made her expression shift. If we're talking about confirmed individual eliminations using personal weapons, that's one set of numbers. If we include coordinated team kills, that's another category. Then there are vehicle eliminations, which some people count as single kills but really represent multiple crew casualties. And of course, there are the orbital bombardment targets, which technically belong to naval statistics but required ground-based target designation. The mathematical complexity she was describing suggested that human military record-keeping had evolved into something approaching a specialized science, complete with subcategories and methodological distinctions that made traditional accounting seem primitive by comparison. "How many subcategories are we discussing?" Captain Onyx asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who suspected the answer might require them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about numerical systems. "Oh, dozens," Hazel said cheerfully. "The military loves its statistics. Individual kills, squad kills, vehicle kills, structural eliminations, area denial casualties, collateral eliminations, friendly fire incidents, though we try to minimize those, plus all the specialized categories for different types of operations. Counterinsurgency work has completely different metrics than conventional warfare, and peacekeeping missions use another set entirely." The way she rattled off categories of elimination suggested that human military culture had developed a taxonomies for violence that operated on principles requiring advanced degrees in both mathematics and philosophy to fully comprehend. "And your personal numbers across all these categories?" Minister Blue Crystalwing asked, his harmonic voice carrying frequencies that suggested either profound curiosity or species-wide existential dread. Hazel tilted her head again with that same innocent expression that had started this entire conversation. "Well, that depends on the time frame you want to use for analysis." The diplomatic lounge had achieved the sort of atmospheric tension typically reserved for moments when entire civilizations collectively realized they had been swimming in the shallow end of a pool that contained significantly larger predators. It was the kind of silence that preceded either profound revelations or complete civilizational restructuring, and given the circumstances, both seemed inevitable. "You know what?" Hazel said suddenly, her expression brightening as if struck by a helpful thought. "Maybe I should clarify something. This whole region, everything within about 50 light-years of this station, we consider this pacified space." The word pacified landed among the assembled diplomats like a tactical nuclear device disguised as casual conversation. It was the sort of term that forced intelligent beings to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about concepts like active conflict zones and relative safety. Ambassador Crimson's ceremonial plates began clicking in patterns that suggested either intense calculation or complete mechanical breakdown. "Pacified," he repeated, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid reconstruction. "This entire sector." "Right," Hazel confirmed, with the helpful enthusiasm of someone finally able to provide useful context. "Standard peacekeeping deployment. The local governments requested assistance with some minor territorial disputes and resource allocation issues, so we helped sort things out. Pretty routine stuff, honestly." Minister Blue Crystalwing's form had achieved color combinations that had no names in any known language, cycling through hues that suggested either transcendent enlightenment or complete chromatic panic. "The Meridian Wars lasted 18 months and involved 7 species across 12 star systems." "Oh, that," Hazel said, waving dismissively. Yeah, the Meridian thing got a little complicated because everyone had different ideas about property rights and territorial sovereignty. But once we established clear boundaries and reasonable resource sharing agreements, everything settled down pretty quickly. Though, I suppose settle down might be understating the cultural adjustment period. Captain Onyx's tail had gone completely motionless, which, in Saurian body language, indicated either profound meditation or the psychological state that preceded either flight or fight responses. The cultural adjustment period involved complete governmental restructuring across multiple worlds. Well, sure, Hazel said, as if explaining something obvious. No point in implementing half measures when you're trying to establish lasting stability. The old governmental systems weren't really equipped for modern interstellar commerce and resource management, so we helped them upgrade to more efficient models. Most of the locals seemed pretty happy with the improvements once they got used to the new systems. The casual way she described what intelligence reports characterized as comprehensive political reorganization involving multiple species and star systems made the assembled diplomats feel as if they were listening to someone discuss weekend home improvement projects, while simultaneously realizing that the home in question was the entire galactic political structure. Nexus's feathers had arranged themselves in patterns that resembled the plumage of a bird that had encountered something beyond its comprehension of natural phenomena. And this represents routine peacekeeping. For this sector, absolutely, Hazel confirmed. I mean, this is supposed to be my quiet assignment. Usually I'm stationed in more active theaters where things get genuinely interesting. But Command figured I could use some downtime after the Andromedus campaign, so they assigned me to this nice, peaceful, diplomatic posting. The phrase nice, peaceful diplomatic posting created the sort of cognitive dissonance that made intelligent beings question whether words still retained their traditional meanings. It was like describing a black hole as a minor gravitational inconvenience, or referring to supernovae as localized lighting adjustments. Your previous assignments were more active, Minister Blue Crystalwing asked, his harmonic voice carrying frequencies that suggested either profound scientific curiosity or species-wide existential terror. So much more active, Hazel said with a nostalgic tone of someone recalling particularly enjoyable vacations. The Andromedus thing was a proper campaign. Multiple galaxy arms, dozens of species, some really interesting tactical challenges. That's where you get your serious statistics. This current posting is practically a vacation by comparison. The assembled diplomats exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication, most of which centered around the sudden realization that their threat assessment protocols might need complete overhaul. What they had assumed was a significant military presence designed to intimidate neighboring systems was apparently the equivalent of a human military officer on medical leave. Perhaps, Ambassador Crimson said, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who had just realized they were negotiating with a force of nature rather than a conventional military representative. We should formalize our mutual cooperation agreements immediately. Excellent idea, Hazel said brightly. I'll let Admiral Storm Hawkeye know that everyone's interested in extending the current peacekeeping arrangements. She'll be delighted. She was just mentioning how much she enjoys working with species that appreciate the value of proactive conflict resolution. And thus, the Pentarch Alliance discovered that in the grand mathematical universe of interstellar diplomacy, there existed scales of peaceful cooperation that required entirely new forms of calculus to comprehend properly.